Connie Walker is an internationally award-winning journalist who has been shining a spotlight on Indigenous stories for decades. Season 2 of her podcast, Stolen, won her both a Peabody and a Pulitzer Prize. It also landed her on Time magazine's list of the top 100 most influential people. It's a personal story, and Connie and I sat down recently to talk about the challenges of Stolen and finding joy in community. So Stolen, the podcast, it's just wrapped up its 3rd season. It's in season 2 where you decide to make it personal and you tell your dad's story. Mm-hmm. Your dad was a residential school survivor, went to St. Michael's, and you learn about not only some of his experiences, but he then goes on to be an RCMP officer. And the journey, the questions really begin on this story that you find out about when your dad has this stop on a highway as an RCMP officer. Can you tell everybody who doesn't know that story?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know the story. Like I was, you know, it wasn't until after the discovery was made in Kamloops a couple of years ago when people started talking more about their residential school experiences and sharing their stories. And I was just scrolling on my phone one day on Facebook, and I saw a post that was written by my brother, Hal Cameron. And he told a story in this post that my dad had told him about one night when he was on patrol in rural Saskatchewan in the late 1970s, and he pulled over a vehicle. And when he got to the driver's side window, he realized that he knew the driver and that it was a priest who had abused him at residential school. And my dad beat up this priest on the side of the road that night and expected for there to be some consequences, but nothing ever happened. And it became this story that he told. And when my brother shared it on Facebook, you know, I remember feeling so sick reading it, but then also it making sense in some ways. I didn't know anything about my dad's experience at all at residential school. I knew he had gone, but I didn't know where he went or for how long. And I didn't know that he had been abused there. You mentioned you talked to family, but you also talked to friends. And you talked to a gentleman named Eugene who went to St. Michael's along with your dad. Mm-hmm. And I thought he gave you some really interesting, I wouldn't call them words of advice, or maybe even a caution, but he said, don't play with this, as in don't play with survivors' stories. Can you unpack what that meant to you? Well, the other side of that interview is me sitting like on a patio in Saskatoon, like bawling, essentially, like, you know, just crying, because he had shared so much in that interview about his own experience at residential school, and it really unlocked for me, I think, some of the brutality of what he and my father must have gone through there. And when he said those words, don't play with this, it was actually passing on something an elder had told him when he first said he was going to be starting to work with residential school survivors. And I also think that, you know, he really, I think, challenged us to try to amplify the voices of survivors and not to speak for them. And it really changed the shape of how we produced our podcast, because the very next episode is all survivors from St. Michael's in their own words, telling their stories of what they endured and what they survived at this school that was open for over 100 years and that 4 generations of my family attended.
Wow. One of the things that you say early on in season 2, when you learn this story, is immediately it's like the curious kid that must have always existed, and you're like, I want to find the priest. If he's alive, I want to find this priest.
That wasn't actually my initial thing. My initial thing was wanting to know about my dad, and one of my producers, Anya Schultz, who's not Canadian, and for a lot of it, I think this was like an education to her. Her question was like, what about the people who were perpetrators of abuse? Like, what happened to them? What happened to this priest? And that was the light bulb moment that it was like, yeah, why do we not actually ask questions about alleged abusers in residential schools?
Like we would for any other story like that.
And that we know that, like, you know, like these schools were open for 100 years, like 26,000 survivors went through the IEP process in the residential school settlement for severe abuse, and the government, through that process, knows the name of alleged perpetrators. They know exactly how many times they were accused of abuse, when, where, and none of that information is public.
You not only find the paperwork and get to read through some of the writings, find some photographs that have questionable intent, but you actually find the priest and you sit down and interview the priest. And what blew me away listening to that conversation, I was trying to imagine it in my mind, but first of all, your composure in being able to have the discussion. And secondly, what was that like to sit across from that person and look at their face?
It was so challenging. You know, I couldn't process any of the emotions while it was happening. It was really just trying to remind myself of the questions that I had for him, the importance, thinking of because 2 people in my family, I don't know if he was the priest that abused my father, but he was at the school at the same time as him. And 2 of my dad's brothers accused him of sexually abusing them. And you know, I thought of them, and I thought of the questions of all of the survivors. And he was not only just a priest at the school, he was a principal for many years at that school. And he went on to work at other, you know, in other Indigenous communities. And you know, he was accused of abusing kids at other residential schools. And, you know, I think that was what was so, you know, shocking to me actually about the whole experience, was how I've been a journalist for over 20 years. I've been reporting on residential schools and the intergenerational effects of residential schools for many years. And it really felt like this was the first time that I was understanding the scope of the abuse at this school. Was the podcast really opened my eyes to that. And also just how the window for accountability is shrinking every day.
Because of the age of some of the perpetrators.
And also the age of survivors, you know, through the process. And actually, I just found out 2 days ago that priest has passed away. He died.
I want to end by asking about joy. Because in the pain and the trauma of these stories, there is also the joy and celebration of resilience and truth and exposure of truth. And you share in the final episode this beautiful moment. It's yourself, your daughter, your brother, you're picking sweetgrass, and it's a celebration of family and culture and community. So it makes you smile listening to it. So what brings you joy in the midst of all your work that you're doing?
I mean, it is that. It's my family, right? I feel like that's, I was just home in Saskatchewan for 10 days. I come from like a really, really close-knit, loving family. Like both of my grandparents on my mom's side were residential school survivors. And in spite of whatever they experienced at those schools, and they attended them when they were, you know, very small children. My grandpa was 6 years old when he went. Like they showed us so much love. And they showed us, you know, the importance of family and community and responsibility to one another. And, you know, those are values that I take with me everywhere. And it's also, I think, you know, there are hard things, absolutely, about these stories and these truths, but there's so much beauty in our families and in our culture and in our communities. And I'm so lucky that I have that with me everywhere. And I feel like it's, you know, my responsibility as a person, but also, you know, as a journalist to take on these stories. Like, you know, I feel privileged to be able to do it. And I really hope I get to continue.
I think you will get to continue. I'm really happy for you. I'm proud of you, but I'm really happy for you, and I'm glad to know, because I've seen you work for a really long time to be authentic, honest, and true, and it makes me really happy to see all of that being rewarded and having such a huge impact.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you liked this, be sure to subscribe here, or you can check out more Your Morning videos right here.